What would happen if each of the Squid Game players were dropped into the backrooms? Squid Game players were placed in a chaotic environment that acted as a melting pot of every bad thing humanity had to offer, whereas the backrooms are devoid of everything that humans are familiar with. Unlike the Squid Games arena, the backrooms are quiet, a little too quiet. Could the players perform better in a more quiet environment? Or will the silence suffocate them until they die a slow death? How will the Squid Game players react to the unique set of challenges that the backrooms provide? Stick around to the end and you'll find the answer to all of that, and then some. For simplicity's sake, we're going to be using the Kane Pixel version of the Backrooms that is connected with the Backrooms movie. Now, although this version of the Backrooms doesn't have thousands of levels like other versions of the lore, I will be using a level system to categorize the horrors of the Backrooms in order to incrementally eliminate players based on which level of challenges the Squid Game players would overcome, with each level getting more difficult than the last. On top of that, it's probably super unlikely that any of the players would clip into the backrooms at the same time, so we'll assume that the players are entering the backrooms alone. But with all of that out of the way, it's time to see how far Squid Game players could make it in the backrooms. These immediate aspects of the backrooms are mostly non-lethal, but still will play a part in disorienting the players as they adapt to their new environment. The backrooms is pretty much fully detached from the outside world, so if the players clip through before they enter the Squid Game competition and have their cellular devices or electronics, they wouldn't function properly. But the only things that they had in their contacts were a bunch of people hounding them to pay their debts, so honestly it might not matter that much. There's also the fact that the backrooms are full of bacillus bacteria that fills the atmosphere of the backrooms. But no matter how potentially lethal this bacteria might be, it is not a pathogen that could multiply or reproduce to infect you or anything like that, which means that inhaling it won't harm the players in any way. This is because the autopsy report confirms that the bacteria relies on dead bodies in order to multiply, so all of the players will be safe from the bacillus bacteria while they're alive. But the most lethal aspect of this preliminary level is, believe it or not, the first thing the players will experience upon entering the backrooms: the initial drop. The initial drop into the backrooms, assuming that the players are not no clipping from the side, will undoubtedly not be a very pleasant fall, as you might expect. But most players would probably be able to bounce back, with the only ones who the relatively high drop would be deadly for being the older players. Players like 001, 017, and 149 are super old, so they'd pretty much be heavily immobilized by the drop and become easy prey for what lies ahead, so we can basically consider them dead. Players 100 and 044 are on the older side but still have some youth in them, which is why 100 is pretty good at jump rope and 044 was pretty good at running in hide and seek, so they'd probably be winded a bit, but not enough to completely immobilize them. But now that we got that out of the way, we can get into the real horrors of the backrooms. As for the main threat that the backrooms are known for, the players will undoubtedly have to deal with the huge labyrinth that is this liminal space, which will definitely evoke the same confusion and fear that we typically see with the found footage victims when they realize how vast the environment is. However, it's important to note that the Kane's version of the backrooms might not be as infinite as people might think, which is why if the found footage victims end up running in circles and retracing the same landmarks as they try to escape. So navigating the maze will be disorienting for the players at first, but it's unlikely that they'd get lost or anything like that. So even though the maze aspect is one of the first challenges they will face in the backrooms, chances are that they'll survive. But it's still gonna give them a good shock when they realize that, unlike the Squid Game maze layouts, there are no coherent design choices for the backrooms environment. Another threat that belongs on this level is something that isn't mentioned a lot, but is very lethal when you think about it. Found footage 2 shows that large objects can clip into the backrooms as well. If one of the players was standing in an unlucky spot, there's literally nothing that he or she could do to defend against a speeding car crashing into them from above, or even the side for that matter. But no matter how potentially dangerous this could be, the likelihood of this happening is very low, since the timing would have to be so precise that the Squid Game players wouldn't get killed this way unless they were just extremely unlucky. But as you'll soon see, these trivial challenges are the least of the Squid Game players' worries in comparison to what comes next. Although the labyrinth aspect of the Backrooms is what it's known for, the real horror comes from what the players will have to endure in the process of traversing it. This is because as the players walk around in an attempt to find an exit, they will slowly tire themselves out, making traveling much harder, and that's going to give them trouble when it's time to run away from the entities, whether it be from getting lured in by the human voice mimicry or just simply stumbling upon one while searching for an exit. This encounter will do nothing but worsen their exhaustion. Even though most players will be able to outrun the slow-moving entities, we know that the average civilian that clips into the Backrooms usually ends up dying by this part, so we can consider all of the players with no particular skills eliminated, which includes the vast majority of the background characters as well as the main characters with no particular skills, like player 124, player 095, player 100's goons, etc. As for the main characters, an easy target for the entity would be Thanos. When Min-Su takes some of Thanos' drugs, he starts seeing hallucinations, so we can assume that the same was true for Thanos when he took the drugs. The problem with this is that the Backrooms are trippy enough as it is, so Thanos would be done for. Another easy target would be player 222 because of her pregnancy, with her being more vulnerable as the pregnancy goes along. And that's not to mention the fact that she could die in the process of giving birth. And even if she did manage to have the baby, they just end up dying together in the Backrooms. Player 218's survival skills rely on the use of others to succeed, so there's nothing he's done that's shown that he could think his way past this level while alone. The same goes for player 333, as him and 218 are very similar. Even though player 044 is confirmed by the creator to be able to see the future, for one, the creator also said that her powers are dulled, and for two, the Backrooms is a place where the past, present, and future exist at once, which would definitely mess with her powers. If her shamanistic powers worked in this environment, she would definitely have a chance of making it past this level, but with the fall damage from the initial drop and her non-functional powers, she'd be left to wobble around until she inevitably gets picked off. Player 111 has a medical field background that gives him the potential to possibly be able to identify the entity being made of bacteria and maybe somehow figure out a way to beat it, but that's unlikely, so we can consider him dead too, because we all saw how bad he is at traveling through maze-like infrastructure. Frontman, player 120, and player 390 all have some sort of law enforcement / military training, so they'd most likely be able to outmaneuver the entity. Player 062's main attribute is his implied athleticism that would likely help him evade the entity, and 067 is excellent at navigating foreign environments, which would undoubtedly help her make her way around the complex while avoiding the entity as well. But as you already know, avoiding the entity is just half of the battle. What's more difficult than avoiding the entity? Facing the entity head on and surviving. Right off the bat, someone that you might not expect to survive out of the remaining players is player 100. In Found Footage 1, the protagonist finds writing on the wall that says, "Don't move, stay still," which supports what we know about the entity. It always checks to make sure what it is seeing is a living thing by trying to trick its victim into making a noise or moving. And if it doesn't move, it assumes that it's just an object, like the tripods in Motion Detected. Many people might assume that the entity wrote that message to lure in victims, but it couldn't have been written by the entity since it doesn't have the intelligence or the physical capabilities to write words, which makes sense since the entity actually stands behind the Found Footage 1 protagonist and only attacks him when he turns around and confirms that he's not an object. Luckily for player 100, his self-defense mechanism is playing dead, so if the entity stumbled upon his motionless body, it just assumed that he was a corpse or some other lifeless object, which is in player 100's best interest since he's still injured from earlier and can't do much running. But what about those who have no other choice but to fight back? From the backroom footage, we see that the entity never goes after the async crew in the backrooms, even though it's in the same area, but always attacks people when they are alone. The only reason a creature would avoid a confrontation is because it thought it could lose. So even though different entities have been shown to be strong enough to throw chairs with significant force, the entity still felt like a group of 3 to 4 async crew members would overpower it, and that's where player 199 comes in. Ali was able to lift a single man with one arm and suspend him in the air without moving a muscle. In order to replicate this feat, both player 456 and player 120 had to team up, and if we acknowledge the fact that they were using their entire bodies as opposed to just one arm, it becomes clear that player 199 easily has the lifting strength of 3 to 4 individuals. And since high lifting strength and high striking power comes in a package deal for characters with a normal human physiology like player 199, Ali would be able to trade evenly or even overpower the entity, and it wouldn't be able to do much about it. And for a predatory creature like the entity that never wants to fight at a disadvantage and only wants to pick off the weak, it most likely would end up fleeing the scene. And since player 101 survived a jump at least 20 meters down a Korean bridge and survived, at which height the water would be like landing on concrete after jumping off of a 6-story building, the entity doesn't really have the power to do anything to hurt him since its strongest feat is throwing a chair with significant force. So it wouldn't want to deal with player 101 either. We also know that the entity is weak to fire as it is made up of bacteria, and it just so happens that player 212 always keeps a capsule inside of her body that contains a lighter. To be fair, she has never used the lighter offensively in the show, but it also wouldn't be a stretch to say that it is within a human psychology to use whatever weapon they have on hand to survive, especially with how crazy player 212 can get. So if the entity snatched player 212 like it did to the protagonist of Found Footage 1, it is plausible to say that she could burn the bacteria to bits in self-defense. We also know that player 218 was a habitual smoker outside of the games who kept a lighter on him, which would allow him to stand as much of a chance against the entity as player 212 if he clipped into the backrooms during his daily life. Maybe even more so, since 218 with a lighter is much smarter than player 212. If the front man clips into the backrooms when he has a gun, then he could stall or even immobilize the entity. We know that the entity is still bound by the laws of physics, so pushback from the frontman's gun could definitely make it stumble. Frontman's training as a police officer, 15 years of tactical experience, and his perfect aim that has made him impervious to missing a shot in the show would allow him to easily be able to target one of the entity's limbs and blast it enough times to immobilize it or even scare it away. But if the frontman doesn't have a gun, then he will most likely die on the upcoming level. Starvation, dehydration, and insanity are all of the side effects that you would expect from being in an environment that is devoid of food, water, and human interaction. Unlike the entities, these aren't problems that the remaining players can run from. That's exactly why the front man would undoubtedly fall victim to these effects if he was left to hide from the entity without a gun. The same is true for everyone else who simply had no choice but to evade the entity, like 067, 062, 120, and 390, unless they were really lucky. And that's because finding a way out is much harder when you can't traverse the full map freely. As for player 100, he could just play dead every time he runs into the entity, so he'd mostly be fine, since he's mostly free to explore the map. But his speed of trying to find a way out would be much slower, since he's both injured and would most likely have to strategically play dead to evade the entity. But the truth is that everyone will die on this level unless they find a way to escape. And that brings us to the final level. In the same way that people can clip into the backrooms, it's not entirely impossible to clip out of the backrooms. The Found Footage 2 protagonist runs into a room in the backrooms and experiences electric sparks before the camera cuts out, and then the footage is seen in the real world. So we can assume that she reverse clipped out of the backrooms and survived along with her footage as she was holding the camera when the warp happened. Other reverse clips include the sidewall clip that can be seen in the Backrooms movie, and the most dangerous downward clip that can result in you falling from the sky. But at the end of the day, it just all comes down to luck for the remaining players. Player 100, Player 199, Player 101, Player 212, Player 218 with a lighter, and Frontman with a gun don't have to worry about the entity giving them trouble, so they'd actually have a higher chance of finding a way out. But although these 5 players' fates remain mostly uncertain, what remains absolutely certain is the survival of player 456. Gi-Hun's luck factor is something that can't be ignored. Gi-Hun was saved from getting shot in red light green light by luck, was saved because of his sweat and honeycombs, and was so lucky that he was able to temporarily derail his own destiny, even though it caught up to him nonetheless. This is because player 044 tells Gi-Hun that he lived longer than he was supposed to, meaning that he was supposed to die in the previous Squid Game, but was so lucky that he evaded that fate. And the fact that Gi-Hun died to the games even after redirecting his fate the first time actually confirms that Gi-Hun's fate is unavoidable. This means that even if his luck wasn't enough for him to escape, 456 would still inevitably clear levels 1 through 5 and make his way out of the Backrooms, because his destiny is to give his life to the games. So in the end, Player 100 probably has the lowest chance of beating level 5, as he has no way of fully removing the entity problem. Player 199, Player 101, Player 212, Player 218 with a lighter, and Frontman with a gun have a decent likelihood of beating level 5 because they either have the strength or tools to keep the entity at bay, and player 456 has a 100% chance to beat level 5 and escape the Backrooms because of his destiny. If you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.